Now for some fun stuff, specifically Cold War pop culture. Also fun, by the way, seeing how long my beard will get before we're finally all able to go outside again. The Cold War was a whole new era and a whole new way of thinking. And this is going to obviously influence how people get entertained. And this is particularly true when it comes to horror. What you see pictured here are what are sometimes referred to in the movie business and the history business as the universal monsters, which doesn't mean they're monsters that are universal, although they are, but rather that these are the stars of the horror movies that were released by Universal Pictures, Universal Movie Studio, starting in 1931. Most of these were first shown, most of these characters first appeared in Universal movies in the 1930s, except for the guy on the upper right, the creature from the Black Lagoon. He actually is not from that era. He was sort of the last Universal throwback. He was actually 1950, 1951, somewhere around there. So let's take him out of the equation. Don't think about the fish guy for a second. And just look at the others. These are the characters that people found horribly frightening during the Depression and into World War II. And a lot of these creatures, a lot of these characters are really almost like stereotypes now. And if you look at some of the 1930s, 1940 movies, they seem kind of quaint, almost funny to us. But to people at the time, they were terrifying. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the pop culture of the Great Depression. 1931 saw the release of both Dracula and Frankenstein, and people were screaming and passing out in the movie theaters and stuff like that. And they were very popular to the point that they then introduced other horror characters. In case you don't recognize them, you probably recognize all of them. Starting there on the left, you've got the Mummy, who was played by Boris Karloff. And then you've got the Invisible Man, who's visible right there because he's all wrapped up in bandages. Then you've got Frankenstein's monster, who was also played by Boris Karloff. You have Dracula in the middle in the back, played by Bela Lugosi. And in the front, you've got the Wolfman, played by Lon Chaney Jr. And then right there to the right of him, you have the Bride of Frankenstein. And on the end, you've got the Phantom of the Opera. So again, this is what people found scary in the 1930s. What do these characters have in common? They actually have a couple of things in common. Now, you could say that they're all supernatural, but they're not. Frankenstein's monster and the Invisible Man are not supernatural. They're the products of science. Now, the Mummy and Dracula and the Wolfman, they're supernatural. The Phantom of the Opera is really just a guy with a scarred face that kind of acts really weird. So it's not their origin, although those who are supernatural, the vampire and the werewolf, and then the living dead, that is the mummy, the walking dead, if you will, those are the types of tropes that appeared in medieval folklore that were used to frighten people long, long before there were film cameras or even printing presses. And you could argue that a creature like, for example, Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein also fit into that Walking Dead type of thing because they're reanimated corpses, even though it was done by science. So those type of really like ancient ideas with a couple of more modern ones added in. Another thing that you'll notice about all of these characters is that all the films are set in a certain part of the world, and that part of the world was Europe. Now, Dracula takes place in Transylvania, which is in Romania. The Frankenstein stories take place in Germany, I believe. Phantom of the Opera is in Paris. The Invisible Man took place in England. The Wolfman, played by Lon Chaney Jr., an American actor with an American accent, nonetheless takes place in England. So I think the story is that Lawrence Talbot, the guy who has the curse of the werewolf, had actually been raised in the United States, and he's come home to England, where he's originally from. So that's in England on the foggy moors. And now the mummy might not seem to fit in, right? Because this is an Egyptian mummy. Egypt is in North Africa. But ask yourself, in the 1930s, and for a long time before that, who had been in control of Egypt? That would be Great Britain. And the story actually revolves around some English archaeologists who find this mummy and bring him back to England. So, again, fish guy, that's a different story that takes place in the Amazon River in South America. But all these others are set in Europe, in the old world. And at least half of them are supernatural beings from old folklore, ideas that had been around for centuries, and those that have a scientific element still are can be tied into some of those supernatural themes. So what does that mean? That means that what really scared people in the 1930s had something to do with Europe. It had something to do with the old country, the old world, the legends of the old world that came out of places like Britain and Germany and Romania, etc. Now, what was really actually in real life scaring people in the United States in the 1930s and into the 1940s, that's what was going on in Europe, in the old world. It wasn't modern. It was a vestige of the past, and it was all centered right there around Europe. And it seemed as though maybe some modern technological and scientific things had been added, but that underneath that you still had these groups, these national groups and countries and ethnicities that had been around for a very, very long time, that still carried with them some very fearful things, even more fearful as the 1930s went on and Hitler's reach became stronger. So thinking about it in that context, you can see how these types of creatures were sort of an outlet, sort of a symbolism for the things that were going on that really did scare people. Now, it's hard to think about the stuff that really scares you, right? Because it's really scary. So if you can get catharsis by being scared by something that kind of reminds you of that, but isn't that, and that you know isn't really real, you can purge yourself of those fearful emotions safely. All right? Well, this is, like I said, a lot of these things seem almost silly to us now. What changed? Clearly, by the end of World War II, this old world European magic and folklore stuff didn't really seem to fit in with people's modern fears. People started to fear something different.
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset. Chick is right. This is awful silly stuff. Dracula.
That is demonstrated in this 1948 movie, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Now, to my great consternation and tragedy, whenever I mention Abbott and Costello in class, almost no one knows what I'm talking about anymore. But the Who's on First guys, some of you may have heard of them. They were two of the most popular comedians of the 1940s, and they had a long series of movies. And in this one, 1948, it's called They Meet Frankenstein, but they actually met Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman. And it was played for laughs. And here's what's interesting about that. Dracula was played by the guy who played Dracula in the Universal movies, Bela Lugosi. And the Wolfman was played by the same guy who played the Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr. They couldn't get Boris Karloff, I guess, to be the monster, so they got Glenn Strange, better known as Sam the bartender on Gunsmoke. And also there was a cameo, if you can call it that, by the Invisible Man, played by Vincent Price, one of the great horror actors who was just near the beginning of his career. The point is, this was played for laughs, but the monsters played by the actual original actors, and they weren't playing it for laughs. They were being serious, right? Dracula was being very Dracula-like. Lon Chaney was being very Wolfman-y, and it was hilarious. That demonstrates that to the movie-going public, these things that a decade before had seemed terrifying now seemed kind of silly. Like, this isn't really something that would be dangerous. It's something for kids to laugh at. Well, if that's the case in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, what did people find scary?